Contercast. My name's Kat Boyd, and I'm joined with my lovely co-host David Jameson.
I'm doing very well. Before you ask, the old tradition. At the end of a long day here. It's always strange with these. We've got an international guest on the call, and it's always strange to think they're speaking to us early in the afternoon before they're completely wrecked by the day's labours. But I'm pretty wrecked.
Well, as David said, we're joined today with Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the editor of the US-based online magazine Jacobin, which I'm sure plenty of our listeners are readers of as well. It's nice to have you on, Bhaskar.
Thanks for having me. I'm already wrecked. It's 2 p.m. here, but my day basically ends at 1:30. I'm done for the day. I'm just waiting, counting the hours.
I'm feeling really bummed out about coronavirus today, to be honest. It's just too much. I think this is now, David, is this our 4th full lockdown, stay at home order? I think this is the 4th. To be honest, I've lost track.
Yeah, it's impossible to say.
Britain is basically Plague Island now.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible there with this new variant too, which has apparently just landed in some parts of the US as well. So we have that to look forward to.
That's our gift.
You're very welcome. Yeah, very welcome. Special relationship.
I was blaming the English for that. So if you want to take responsibility, that's okay.
No, well, they're the diseased ones. We'll leave it with them.
Moving on.
Before Bhaskar came on, he said, for once, and I'm sure it was sarcasm, the whole world is discussing America. Because, of course, Britain is a country completely colonized with concerns about American politics, the American political idiom, American culture wars, completely colonized us after, several hundred years after our initial colonization of the American continent, North American. But of course, it is the final act of Trump the movie, and explosive. Jacobin, I think, has been one of the soundest voices on what's going on there. I mean, Jacobin aside that the articles that I've read that you've published have been kind of very sober. Looked at the situation in the round, tried to, check out the kind of truth from the hysteria. But most of the American media I've followed over the last few days, to be honest, has been sort of concerning levels of paranoia about what's going on in the United States, about, this idea that there was an attempted coup or an attempted insurrection or so on, which to me just doesn't, match up with reality. What is your just general sense of what's going on over there, and why this sort of hysteria?
Well, I think to begin with, the safest thing to do when you're in media is to always overstate a threat, because very few people go back and say, oh, well, this journalist said that Trump would use a nuclear weapon, because that was definitely around there. This one had this prediction, or this one had this, and the more hyperbolic you could be, kind of the better, right? It drives in the short-term engagement. In the long term, no one really cares. And I think we're seeing the rise of these moral panics on both left and right, where people engage in the most heated rhetoric possible. Then tempers cool down. People take more sober, level-headed analysis a couple weeks later, but they never go back to acknowledge that maybe they overstepped or overstated something. And I think the medium of social media has a lot to do with it. I've kind of resisted this analysis because it seems to me not especially materialist, but I can't come up with another explanation. I definitely think that there's a fringe of US politics, a pretty large fringe on the far right, that is increasingly violent, which is quite paranoid, which has been emboldened by Donald Trump. he certainly fanned the flames of what happened, and obviously he won't face any consequences for it. Meanwhile, a lot of the idiots that he duped who were engaged in this will be arrested and have no possibility of job prospects. A couple of them died, and whatever else. So that's the usual norm of U.S. politics and world politics, which the elite get away with everything, and other people pay the consequences. So I don't want to downplay the significance of what happened from the standpoint of the human loss of life, the threats to especially left-wing Congress people. Certainly AOC and other left-wing members of Congress felt like their life was in danger and threatened. I don't know all the details. All of it hasn't come out in the investigation, but I think it's very safe to take them at their word. But I think if you were to consider this, I think it's overstepping to call it a coup. And I don't even mean at a semantic level. I just mean, what was their program? Did they try to seize a building, or did they try to seize the levers of power? And I really think it was something of the former, like a violent far-right riot that took a lot of life, and obviously was meant to threaten a democracy, a democratic process, but I don't think it was meant to install a different regime.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would generally agree with that. I mean, I think that my concern is, and David is right when he says that our media is obsessed with American politics, the saturation of not just news about the Capitol, but the reaction to it. So, our First Minister in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, is a big fan of some of the Democratic Party's big players, Hillary Clinton being one of them. So, she's got this real sort of like Hillary Clinton-esque style to her. But I mean, that's really no surprise that we talk about American politics a lot. I think that the thing that I find most concerning about what happened at the Capitol is the real panic around this being a fascist coup. I think that that's like genuinely really unhelpful language that I've seen on Twitter. I think that you're right, that social media does encourage this type of like hot take behavior. I mean, I think that if people are taking, 24, 48 hours to really digest news events and then tweet about it, they shouldn't be slammed for it. And that's, I mean, I definitely saw people saying, echoes of silence from the quote, "Trump is not a fascist" crew, which I think was a reference to you, David, actually. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's a violent right-wing attempt to occupy a building and disrupt a democratic process. It's not an attempt to, seize the levers of power.
See, though, one thing to ask, though, is it was people tweeting and on social media, and you often get those sort of hysterical responses and so on. But it did have a degree of institutional. I mean, I've never seen the BBC covering an issue like they did this one, right? Which is not, of course, to lionize the BBC or pretend that it's got these high standards that no one else has and so on. But for 48 hours after the storming of the building, the BBC's headlines, and I don't mean the guests they had on, though they were also saying this was an attempted coup, there's an attempted overthrow of American democracy. The actual news readers on the hour were saying there was an attempt in the United States. And I really had this feel of like, no one actually believes this. No one who is saying this really thinks that there was an attempt to overthrow the American state by, a few thousand, most of them, real kind of crazies, real paranoia cases, without any kind of plan or platform or whatever. I seriously doubt, to be honest, Trump even, as soon as he realized the implications for him of what was going on in the Capitol building, I doubt he even really wanted it. I doubt that it had much kind of institutional support at all in the Republican Party. But that you saw that obviously on the BBC, obviously on CNN, which has lost it. But also then, of course, There was the whole campaign on social media to remove Trump and lots of kind of coup and on people and all this kind of stuff. So this also did actually have like institutional heft behind it.
Yeah, I think if anything, it was a reminder of the stability of a lot of American Republican, small R Republican institutions, and that immediately this was denounced across the board by the media. Representatives were kind of running away from it happening. Trump's response to me just further reinforced the fact that this is just a deeply nihilistic, megalomaniac kind of figure. His immediate response was to complain that his supporters on the TV looked like they were low class. They looked ugly, they looked low class. And this is obviously the mind of a rich person who thinks in terms of only aesthetics. And that's definitely the thing he has in common with strains of fascism and the right. This lionization. Of style over program, of tactics over program, but yeah, I mean, I think this showed how stable and how unified a certain consensus is in the United States. I think the reason to be a little bit more alarmed is that this could be the prelude to something else. Now, the media has been talking about it using that language, prelude, as in this movement directly will lead to a overthrow of American democracy in 15, 20 years. I don't mean that. What I mean is that this is a sign of growing destabilization. It's a sign that certain norms are being transgressed, that the legitimacy of the state is being transgressed, and maybe that'll be a bad thing if things don't restabilize in the future. I think when it comes to left strategy, the question is twofold. One is this all a distraction from the fact that our enemy number one is Joe Biden starting in about a week? Joe Biden's going to be the head of the US state, and he's no friend of the left. He's no friend of our agenda. And if we're going to get anything passed under a Biden administration with the Democrats with control of government, it's going to be through creating an opposition movement. And tied to that, how do we actually defeat the right in the long run? Well, that's through presenting an alternative program. If this becomes a battle about restoring American democracy, restoring the integrity of American democratic institutions, then we're talking about going back to 2015, back to 2016. We're not talking about building an actual alternative. We're not talking about the issues in which we are not in agreement with mainstream Democrats on, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, all these other programmatic points, because we are in agreement at least about, if I'd rather have bourgeois democracy than no democracy at all. I think every single socialist in America would agree with that. But that only gets us so far. And if we pretend like this is a fringe view in which the socialist left needs to mobilize all of its resources, we're ignoring the fact this is a view embraced by 95% of the US population and all establishment forces in the US.
Yeah, I think this is the really interesting thing, because I mean, one of the features of kind of Trumpism in recent years is it's had the capacity at points to contain left-wing criticisms of the American elite, in a certain way. I mean, it seems to, you have a phenomenon where around the world now, this isn't even just true in the United States, a certain attitude to the right is used on the left, to stop it engaging in a more as you say, systematic, programmatic assault upon the sort of liberal centre. France was the classic case of this. So Mélenchon was aimlessly told that he must get out of the way and form an alliance with, tell his voters to support Macron against Le Pen. And Le Penism is a tradition in France which has a lineage, an actual direct lineage back to a genuine, fascist dictatorship, and so on. So there's always this tension where you can use an anti-fascist analysis as an actual kind of combat orientation against dangerous elements of the right. or it can be used as a kind of, by kind of systemic politicians to kind of, cut the horns off the radical left. But so what I wanted to ask you in those terms is, I mean, are you hopeful that there will be that transition from this slightly manufactured state of emergency in American politics right now to a situation where the left can reorientate in a criticism of the kind of liberal centre?
I would say that a lot of the main forces on the left, from our politicians to a lot of our media outlets, seem to be in a mood of coalition. Now, I'm not against coalition in principle, but if the left in the US isn't aware of our weakness, then we actually think that we have social forces in order to go in a coalition with something. So in other words, if we were in a multi-party parliamentary system and we had the equivalent of 10, 15, 20% of the vote, like I think we would have at a minimum if the Bernie-crat wing of American politics had its own party in a different sort of political system, then it might make sense to say we should go and provide support to a Biden government on certain terms or whatever else. But we're not in that kind of system. And we are also not in that position where we have organized social forces of our own. So part of the key is to build our own institutions, to build our own profile as outsider, left populist, distinct from the Democratic Party. I think that a lot of the focus on impeachment from not just the squad, but from Bernie Sanders has the potential to just make us sound like the most militant Democrats in the room. So in other words, if Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are pushing for impeachment and pushing for all these things, well, while Bernie and the squad are basically just pushing for it harder. That seems to be the emphasis. So we don't want, in other words, in the popular imagination, a view of the left in the United States as just being more strident, more hyper-liberal Democrats. We want a view of the left in the United States, like what was emerging through the Bernie Sanders campaigns, as being distinct at a programmatic level and also at the level of rhetoric, being distinct and pursuing a kind of working class rhetoric. If anything, I think the most savvy person in US politics about how to be very critical about what happened, be very anti-Trump, but be wary of focusing too much on Trump and impeachment has actually been Joe Biden. Like, I think there's a lot about Biden's rhetoric that reflects the fact that he's aware of what working class voters want at a rhetorical level, even though he's not going to deliver it at a programmatic level.
Yeah, I think that's dead interesting. I have wondered, who is that rhetoric for when it's from Bernie or the squad around impeachment? Like, who is that actually trying to speak to? I've been a big fan of Bernie, his movement, the program that he put forward as well in both of his, internal elections and the primaries. But I think that there's some merit to the argument about the United Front that Bernie played along with, the United Front against Trump. The idea that in the selection for the Democratic candidate, that Trump had to go at any cost. And if any cost is worth bearing, then it would be Joe Biden. And I think that the building of that United Front and that coalition, like the quote unquote anti-fascist struggle against Trump, really kind of allowed Bernie Sanders to be in some way undermined by the anti-fascist rhetoric. I think that there's a real concern that some of the political purpose around the, Trump out at any cost anti-fascism is really to discipline the left, so that when there is a united front and the left are rallying around the most powerful democratic pole in society, that, in this case is the very rich centrist option, that's it's kind of used as a point of leverage. And I think that coalition and that united front can it's not necessarily helpful for a left populist program.
Yeah, I mean, I think that given the structure of U.S. politics, voting for Joe Biden in a swing state was absolutely the right tactical vote to do. But there was always a difference between tactical voting and advocating tactical votes and going out and spending institutional resources canvassing for Joe Biden, as opposed to canvassing for down ballot candidates and for our particular programs. Like we'll canvass, we as in DSA, will canvass for any candidate, let's say, who supports Medicare for all and supports this and this priority. And obviously, if you're rallying people down ballot, that has the effect of increasing votes for Joe Biden, because people don't often split tickets. But the premise of this, even from people advocating a much more forthright, endorse Joe Biden, spend resources trying to get Joe Biden elected, was that once he was elected, we would then quickly pivot to opposition. So that remains to be seen. I think that a lot of the premise of what AOC and other members of the squad are doing is that they are winning small victories for people behind the scenes. Like no one goes into this thinking, I'm going to sell out and just join in coalition with our enemies. People go into it thinking, I'm going to deliver some victories and I'm navigating this inside-outside strategy. And therein lies, I think, the danger, which we'll have to see how it plays out, of a co-optation where the squad, Bernie, don't actually need the existing left. They're kind of figures onto themselves, but they also don't have any institutional base, really. So this is the dilemma that we've seen with a lot of populist experiments around the world. And I think those of us on the socialist left trying to use these electoral campaigns to jumpstart a different process of base building, a different process of organizing, will have to grapple with that fact that, the dilemma, I guess, of populism all around the world, which is that everything is hollowed out. All we have is these big candidates. We have no mechanism to discipline these candidates, and they have no real incentive to be disciplined. They're just trying to win gains as they can for their constituents, I think in good faith. But yeah, we just have to, I think, seriously assess what we got from this wave of struggle in the last 10 years. I've been among the most optimistic people about what happened over the last 10 years, but what it'll take to jumpstart a new wave of struggle in the next 10 years. And I think this cycle, which began with Occupy, which began with Podemos and the movements in Spain and the Arab Spring and whatever else, is more or less coming to a close all around the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Leads us on to the kind of the thesis that you developed about class struggle, social democracy. I was rereading some of this stuff in preparation for the discussion today, and I thought it was a couple of things really interested me. One was you mentioned that Bernie Sanders comes from a certain tradition, and this wasn't always particularly understood on the kind of left wing of the Democratic Party. I remember you having a debate with someone about Elizabeth Warren, and you were kind of pointing out some of the differences between Biden and Warren, given that they seem to be so rhetorically close. And you were sort of saying you've got to look sort of past just the policy positions and understands the context for these two different candidates. And Sanders comes from a longer kind of populist socialist tradition in American society. I've got a couple of questions for you. One on AOC, who you just mentioned, and yes, of course, the main concern here is like the institutional pressures that politicians feel, particularly when they don't necessarily have a strong institutional counter pressure, like from mobilizations or trade unions or whatever. But isn't a factor there also that a younger generation of the left don't necessarily have those kind of traditions that you spoke about in regards to Sanders, who also has the benefit, it must be said, of like a long career in activist politics and a longer perspective that gives some people. But another point that you made that I thought was really interesting is that with someone like Sanders, and you could say this for some of the other experiments as well, like Corbynism, kind of like it's a bit different with things like Syriza and so on, but you know, the difference with social democracy today that should distinguish it from debates that you get sometimes in kind of like sectarian left corners. You get people who say, I mean, we've all seen it. How can you back Bernie Sanders, or how can you back Jeremy Corbyn? Don't you know that the Social Democrats killed Rosa Luxemburg, and all this kind of like embarrassing stuff? The point that's being missed is this is 2020, and the Social Democratic kind of populist left candidates defined themselves against the Liberal centre, had no choice but to do that. They couldn't define themselves against the organised communist left because that doesn't really exist. And so they became a kind of lightning rod conducting those sorts of populist energies. But, you know, I mean, do you think that I mean, you've just kind of said, you know, that phase has come to an end. Do you think that analysis of the sorts of political projects that are likely to emerge over the next 10 years, do you think it still holds? Or do you think that the defeat of those projects, you know, represents something more profound, something that's going to move us on to a kind of different future?
Well, I think that we had a shortcut. So traditionally, those of us on the socialist left would say, well, we need to treat elections like they're just a temperature gauge, pressure gauge of working class levels of organization, levels of class consciousness, and whatever else. I think that's very, very, very bastardized a version of what Engels said about elections. Now, what we tried to do was reverse engineer the process. We said that civil society is so hollowed out. There is no avenue for left advance. There's just nothing. And the defeat of politics, the hollowing out of civil society, seems like a problem in an apolitical sense across the political spectrum, but it's really first and foremost a problem of the left, because the left needs to galvanize and cohere a mass of people, cohere a social force against the interests of capital, whereas a handful of technocrats can govern capitalism in the interest of capital. So the electoral route was a way to use the platform afforded to electoral politics, use a platform that was really the last profound form of political engagement that most people have, especially in a country like the US with extremely low union density and the decline of civic organizations. Politics is really just turning out to vote every 2 years, every 4 years. To use that avenue to push a program and gain popular support for our ideas, then use our positions of power when we win elections and just that campaign of trying to win the election in the first place to rebuild our organizations and rebuild institutions that can continue the class struggle during lulls. I think fundamentally, the idea that electoral politics is our best avenue to class reformation is still correct. It just seems to me that we're going to make less progress with that strategy in the next few years than we have in the last few years. And it seems to me that there's a need for tactical flexibility. So if you think about Occupy, I thought Occupy was a stupid idea. I was waiting for it to fail. It came out of Adbusters, and it came out of what to me at the time, I was maybe more sectarian then, was just, kind of petty bourgeois, anarchistic, elements. Like some of these tactics were used in the UC system, were used in like the new school occupations of like libraries at elite universities in the US and whatever else. So obviously there was some of it in a broader anti-austerity movement, which actually did have some wider support in the UK and in the US, and with the Wisconsin uprising in 2011. But the short of it was, I did not expect anything productive to happen out of it, but obviously it was incredibly productive. It set into motion, I think, a lot of important things. It showed popular support for economic egalitarianism. It did a hell of a lot. So I don't know what I think we need. If I had the answers, I would give it to you. But I just think we need an open mind, the spirit of voluntarism, a spirit of of just tactical flexibility, while still not foregoing the route of running competitive candidates in elections. The left we managed to build in the US through the Bernie Sanders campaign is a left that has a program that is very popular. Our key policy platforms, the things we're fighting for, do in fact have majority support. Our rhetoric is still not exactly popular, but our program is. And we have managed to grow institutions. DSA has grown from 5,000-6,000 members to approaching 100,000 members. So we don't really have a social base. We're not deeply implanted or rooted in working class communities, but there is a widely accepted and popular kind of producerist rhetoric of, those who have to work for a living versus those who exist off wealth, and in that kind of classically populist way. It just so happens that I think a little bit too much of our coalition is on the professional class side of this equation, but it's definitely fine. And if you look historically at the process of class formation, if you look at the people who helped build social democracy in the late 19th century, early European social democracy, a lot of these people weren't exactly workers. They were artisans, they were small traders who were failing, they were, from these classes that were in turmoil because of the rise of industrial society. And from that base, they came to attract a more traditional proletarian base. So there's still a possibility. I'm not one of those people who just sits around complaining about how middle class everything is. I'm not saying that. I mean, I do dislike these people at a just purely apolitical, aesthetic, cultural, level. But I don't assume that that's political analysis, because it really isn't. Yeah, I mean, that's I think that there's still some possibilities for sure. We are on the up. I think in the UK, you could say your experience is more one of blown opportunities, and that I really do think the Corbyn period as being the leader of the opposition could have meant a much more sustained transformation of CLPs. It could have meant something very, very different. I don't really think we had the opportunity. I think we're living through like the 97th, 98th percentile, what could have happened out of a fringe Vermont senator's 2 presidential runs.
There was a really good article that came out in Damage magazine by George Hoare about left populism, and he identified the left populism as presenting itself as an alliance of these young, very energetic, very educated, and probably underemployed activists working alongside older, more traditional working class voters who were kind of anti-establishment, neoliberalism, and kind of distance from the establishment parties as well, the kind of anti-politics, if you like. And the left populism around Corbyn was certainly, I think, very obviously an alliance of these two groups, but I think it's also true of Mélenchon's campaign, and it's definitely true of our own populist moment in Scotland, which was around the 2014 independence referendum. But I think within those coalitions, and in those 3 examples in particular, this splits now between those younger, kind of lower PMC, if you like, younger activists, and those older, more traditional working class voters along culture lines is very pronounced. I don't think that it's the reason that those projects failed, but I do wonder who now takes forward left populist projects when there is such a distance growing between these two groups that were once in alliance around left populist projects, in the aftermath of the populist moment, if you like. And I just wondered if you thought that that might be a problem following the election of Biden.
Can I just add one little thing to that, which is in the British case, I mean, by 2019, the Labour Party coalition had become more middle class. So the biggest loss of votes in on Labour's part were in, I think, among D&E voters. It's a rubbish kind of scale, it's consumer index or whatever. It's not real kind of class, but that, you know, D&E is more or less kind of like poorer, manual, unskilled, in scare quotes, workers. Now, that obviously, I mean, there was a few factors, obviously, in the reason that Corbynism failed in 2019, but the central issue, I would argue, was over the European question. And it's interesting that, you know, Corbynism and Syriza, who, you know, the two big European attempts at this kind of left populist approach, both essentially impaled themselves on the same thing, which was the national question. And social democracy traditionally, you know, whether that's now or in the 30s or 40s, has had a torrid time with the national question. I think this is a big difference with the American experience, because naturally, America being the heartlands of the world system, its national questions are very different. I'm not saying they don't have them, of course they do, but, you know, it's very different to a situation like Europe, where there are institutions like the European Union and so on. I mean, do you think that the national question was a major failing of this model?
So there's a lot there. I should say that to speak to Kat's what Kat was talking about, I recently read or reread that Fabian Society pamphlet from the early 90s, Southern Discomfort. And it seemed to me one of the ironies of the December 2019 election was that in many ways, the Corbyn coalition was the coalition that New Labour wanted to build, in the sense that it was young, cosmopolitan, dynamic, where the shifts were starting to go geographically. Obviously, they didn't do enough to actually win in the South. But if you look at just the vote patterns of where the votes were shifting, and I think there's the mainstream of the Democratic Party under Biden has really, not really under Biden. Biden's continued this process. If anything, his rhetoric has been slightly better in certain ways, but has doubled down on the wealthier suburbanites as the pathway to victory, and the idea that certain demographics are declining, and that these declining traditional working class demographics won't win you elections. So in the U.S., first of all, this is wrong, just even at the political level, because of the way the U.S. system works geographically. The Democrats' voters being concentrated in cities and suburbs of large cities is going to spell doom to them. But I think in other countries and contexts, it's a potential outgrowth of a focus on left populism through elections. So, in other words, if all votes are equal, then why wouldn't you pick up 2 votes from young people in cities, large cities, at the expense of 1 vote in a middle-sized city somewhere else, which is obviously just very different from the traditional socialist focused on social weight and social base. So the idea that, well, certain people actually matter more, not obviously in a moral sense, but in a strategic sense, because the base that, let's say, the left traditionally has had on longshore workers implies a lot of social power. They could call strikes, they could do lots of other things that ordinary people can't do, that we can't do, right? If we stop writing or podcasting tomorrow, like, I think there'll be many upset people, but it will not be enough to change any political calculus. And I think that's one potential danger of the drift from a kind of left electoralism a left electoral politics en route to class reformation can easily become an electoralism that sees votes as the end goal in and of itself and traps us to kind of a prism of what's possible. I think in general, one other potential disadvantage of the left's base being disproportionately middle class is there tends to be, I think, at least in the US, a gross overstatement of bigotries and other things in the actual existing working class. I think, at least in the US, in my experience in the UK, well, in England at least, I think that obviously there's still lots of oppression everywhere in society, but people are in general small p progressives. Like, they're getting more progressive on a lot of these issues. There's in general a live and let live kind of mentality where people, you know, don't want their views kind of forced upon them. It's not like anyone's actually trying to force anything upon them, but they in the abstract don't want that. But they also just generally are libertarians in a sense of just like being fine now with gay marriage, being fine with interracial marriage. All these other things that were previously taboo are no longer. Yet somehow in the left's mind, the traditional working class is totally and irredeemably racist and homophobic and whatever else. Now, to begin with, the working class and a lot of these, lots of parts of the world, I would suspect, is in fact more diverse in terms of racial demographics than other classes, and also probably when it comes to gender too, just if only because there are more women in the workforce and at the higher echelons of elite universities and things like that. I imagine in most places are still male dominated, but even besides for all those facts, these are people who are often living, at least in the United States, in less segregated areas. So if you're a poor white person in the South, for instance, you're much more likely to have a Black neighbor and to have friends and acquaintances and to go to integrated school than if you're a suburbanite. If in a wealthy public school district in the United States. And, you know, so I think there's this false dichotomy we're given, which is, oh, well, we really want to win over these voters and to speak in a rhetoric that appeals to them, but we don't want to compromise on our progressive social views, where the fact is no one's asking you to do that. You know, no one's asking you to all of a sudden embrace forms of oppression because it's politically viable, because in fact, on the whole, it's not politically viable, and it's not what voters are asking for. They're asking for a rhetorical emphasis and focus on economic egalitarian issues, not a sort of betrayal of left-wing values on anything else.
Yeah, I agree. I think people are generally quite relaxed on social issues. Like, that's always been my experience, is that there's this like demonization in a lot of parts of the left of the working class as somehow like unreconstructed like bigots. This is a weird fetish that like parts of like the liberal left have about what working people actually think, which, I mean, you're right, especially like in the States or in like London, it's predominantly not white, the working class, and it's predominantly women. I think that, you know, generally people are pretty chill.
My anecdote is that my family's from Trinidad, so I do have some family in the UK, because, you know, our wave of immigration was mostly within the Commonwealth before, you know, the 80s, and then after that to the US, and the most fortunate recent demographic straight to Canada, where they have both healthcare and they are not in the UK. So my cousins, at least two of them in the UK voted for Brexit on all sorts of like not very thought out, you know, they like Corbyn too, but not very thought out kind of ways. But it was just a healthy reminder for me at the time that the coalition was not quite this coalition of the far right as it was depicted. Wherever you come down on it. I do think that the issues of nationalism and comes out a lot in the UK context, and I think on that issue it's more just a tactical question, where I think if the debate becomes polarized on who loves America the most or who loves Britain the most, then obviously the right is going to win. So we don't want the debate polarized around those issues, because intrinsically, as socialists, we don't believe that a American life is worth more than a Mexican life, or a Scottish life is worth more than an Irish life. It's just like on that issue, if the debate becomes polarized around flag waving, we will lose. So that's one reason not to just sidestep it.
I mean, to be honest, you're hitting on like what has been a major problem for I'll call it the British left, but I mean the English left for a long time. And it's the fact that they have actually always been quite terrified of Englishness. So I've routinely met, excellent socialists in England who would rather be part of a British left, which is always really code for English left, even if being British means invading other countries for oil, or the empire or whatever. Like, they would rather identify as being part of the great British left than being English. And actually, I think that this has caused a massive problem for the Labour Party in particular. Just a few hours before we started recording the podcast, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party just resigned. They are so far behind in the polls in Scotland. And this is after, 150 years of Scotland always just returning Labour votes. I live in Glasgow, and for hundreds of years we've elected Labour politicians. And the national question, particularly for the Labour Party, has become it's where a lot of the fault lines lie now.
So I'm asking because I'm largely ignorant of this, but I think in part for the Labour Party, wouldn't the issue though be that if they just accept that they're a English and maybe Welsh party, they just can't win majorities?
Sure, but they've already lost Scotland. I mean, I suppose there's just always been a squeamishness about England as a nation amongst the Labour left.
I think in part it's a hype.
Just to give you an example, there was a now infamous tweet from Emily Thornberry, the Labour MP, where she took a photograph of a white, I think it was maybe during the EU referendum, and she took a photograph of a driveway that had a white van in it and an England flag flying out the window, and she took a photo and put it on Twitter and said something like, "Look at what our country's become." Do you know what I mean? So it's not just an uncomfortableness, it's a real disdain for this Englishness, which I think has meant that national English consciousness has really they've just ceded a lot of ground to the right.
Yeah, and I guess there's almost I see it a lot with the German left too, where it's a anti-nationalism that's essentially a hyper-nationalism, because they're if English nationalism ever makes a comeback, the whole world is getting conquered again. I'm no, it isn't. You'll be lucky to win round 2 against Argentina if it comes down to it nowadays. But I think that's that's often a part of the roots to it. But again, I think. Yeah, I think it's a little bit tricky in part because I'm not sure how permeable Englishness as an identity is to immigrants and to minorities, in the way that, let's say, Americanism is, in part because of the original sin of America being a settler colony. I think it leads to a thorny set of questions, but at the very least, the left can't be immediately hostile to displays of nationalism, even if it's not going to embrace it itself. But I think the real goal should be to downplay it as much as possible, to just foreground other issues, and to make, let's say, immigration or make patriotism even the number 4, number 5 priority and what voters care about in candidates, and hope that they'll vote for you anyway because of your anti-austerity platform and defense of the NHS and whatever else?
One of the strange things about that fear of England and Englishness is that even more so than in the American case that you were talking about, Bhaskar, like England is one of the most socially liberal countries in the Western world by quite a distance. The UK is one of the countries that is the most accepting of immigration, for example, in the Western world, certainly in Europe. We have traditionally one of the weakest far rights. Obviously in the middle of the last century, most of continental Europe was dominated by fascist governments, which had either come to power under their own, under their own fuel, or they were subject to invasion by a fascist power and had domestic fascist elements elevated, like in France. And Britain's never had that, as strong a fascist tradition. It's had fascist traditions, but not anything like that powerful. And also, it's one of the most sort of atheistic, secularized countries in the world. Our national church. My national church is the Church of Scotland, but the Anglican Church is one of the most liberal congregations in the world. I mean, it's not even comparable to the United States, where the conservative movement in the US has real institutional heft, to pull on. There is a real religious movement in the US, and churches and seminaries and publishers and radios and radio stations and all this kind of stuff. There's nothing even like that in the UK. I mean, the UK is well, with the partial exception of Northern Ireland, I should say, but England, Wales, and Scotland, it's one of the most, it's like liberal politics is utterly hegemonic here. In Scotland, we have a parliament with six liberal parties, including the supposedly centre-right party, which is really, on most policy terms, indistinguishable from the kind of centrist liberal governing Scottish National Party.
I wonder to what extent that's because of the weakness of the workers' movement, right? The reason why you didn't get fascism, the reason why liberalism reigns supreme is really never because they never had to violently suppress the workers' movement like they did in other countries in Europe.
I think that's really part of it. I also think it's probably deeper in a certain tradition of the managed decline of the British Empire. Like the British Empire, David Egerton writes about this in his new book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation. Like the British state has been extremely good at managing its own decline from, top dog status to a subordinate of the United States. In many countries, that becomes like an explosive, chaotic condition. And at times in Britain, it threatened to do that, with like this, the war in Northern Ireland, the so-called Troubles in the 70s. There was a militant workers movement and so on. It had moments where it looked like that could break out. But for the most part, up to the present day, Britain's had a really easy slide from the top and has maintained that famous cohesion that the British state and the British ruling elite have been able to cultivate for centuries. So yeah, it's an interesting one, but it makes it even more peculiar that the left, I mean, in various parts of Britain, but perhaps particularly in England, is so terrified of like the flag of St. George as an image and what it might represent. And you were right, and people saying like the anti-Deutsch in Germany had this idea at the time of the reunification of Germany that if this happened, it would be like Hitler all over again. You had people saying of Brexit, if we leave the European Union, it's going to be, quotes, British Empire 2.0. And you're sort of like, that can't happen. What are we going to do? Invade India? Invade China? But which rising Asian power would you like to kick our asses first? So yeah, it's a really strange one. But see, on this point about the limitations of social democracy as a tradition, I mean, it became really apparent with Labourism, including under Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, Corbyn's a traditional Eurosceptic. He's an anti-EU socialist, as far as can be told from his criticisms of the Maastricht Treaty and so on in the past. But because he became the leader of the Labour Party, he had little choice but to, be a leading member of the Remain campaign. And, up to a certain point, you know, that made sense tactically for him to do that. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I can see the position that he was in. But even once that campaign was over and Leave had won and so on, the institutional pressures just kept building and building on him to concede to this disastrous people's vote stance and so on. But some of those pressures were just simply the fact that it was, as it were, the British state's position to stay in the European Union. The British state was one of the architects of the European Union. The real elite interests in the country didn't want to leave. And that put severe pressure on Corbynism at a time when the Tory party couldn't be relied on to play its traditional role as the spokesperson of the British ruling elite. That put massive pressure on Corbynism.
And also one thing that I think that a lot of the people advocating Remain or a people's vote position from a purely tactical standpoint, that group, what I think they've misunderstood is that once a center-left party loses its heartland, it becomes almost impossible for it to get it back. And then you end up in the same sort of spiral the French Socialist Party is in, that center-left parties across Europe have entered into. So it'd be better to lose while maintaining your traditional core constituents than to narrowly win a minority government. I guess that was the best case scenario in December 2019, with the base and with coalition partners that don't want social democracy, don't want what you want. But I think this gets us to the broader question of a left that has leaders and that has certain ideas that are programmatically socialist, but divorced from any of the traditional base of socialism. So in other words, the dilemma of mid-century social democracy was something of the opposite, in which you had leaders not committed to socialism. You had a ideology that was in name only committed to any sort of rupture with capitalism, and even after 59 in Germany and elsewhere, not even programmatically committed to socialism. But you had the social base right there. So it became easy for the revolutionary left to say, well, there's a group of workers who are in the main voting for parties committed in name to socialism, or who are at least traditionally had those commitments, but these parties are pursuing a road that's not going to lead there. They're because of structural constraints or timidity or whatever else, they're just managing capitalism. It's going to provoke a backlash, and that leaves an opening for the radical left. But here we are, where both the center left and by extension the far left are kind of swimming without a base and that's, again, that gets back to the question of class reformation being the primary goal of what I guess Miliband would call Marxist reformism, which I think should be the stance of everyone on the left, not because we'll immediately be able to deliver huge gains to working people, but because it'll help restore the basis from which we can actually start doing politics again.
I think that's a good place to stop, Bhaskar. Thanks very much, because otherwise it would have been the beginning of a really interesting conversation that could go on for another couple of hours. So yeah, thanks very much for those thoughts, and thanks very much for all the work you do with Jacobin and so on. I think it's a great resource. It's a great read. And yeah, it would be great to speak to you again in the future, assuming of course you still have your democratic rights in America, and the fascists don't take full control and so on.
The threat to democratic rights or civil liberties is actually from Joe Biden, of course, but let's not open up that discussion at this point.
You know, if I have to go into exile, it would be Cuba first, but I would settle for a independent Scotland as a distant second choice to tropical paradise in Cuba.
Oh, that's nice.
Poor choice though.
Terrible idea, mate.
Go for Cuba. Do Cuba. Yeah, it's miserable over here.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed that. I will just we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks for having me. Yep.
See you later.
All right.